Today is the feast day of St. George. The feast day of St. George only falls on a Sunday about once every 7 years or so. So we thought, since our church named St. George's, we'd take the opportunity to celebrate. So let's give it up for our patron saint, St. George. All right. St. George is actually one of the most well-known and honored of all the Christian saints. He's famously known as the hero who slew the dragon. And as a literary and historical figure, though, he's probably a lot more significant than most of us give him credit for. Medieval tales of St. George were wildly popular. In the 11th and 12th century, crusaders went to the Middle East, and they heard stories about this guy, St. George, and they brought those stories back to Europe. And there were stories of him rescuing princesses and slaying dragons, and sometimes slaying dragons in order to rescue princesses. And sometimes the dragons were actual dragons, and sometimes they were metaphorical dragons of evil or sin. But there were countless bedtime stories and fairy tales that were based upon St. George. If you think about it, he shows up everywhere. Writers such as Charles Perrault, the Brothers Grimm, you see these hints of St. George everywhere. The story of Sleeping Beauty, inspired by St. George. Shrek, inspired by St. George. St. George was the archetypical hero. He was the one who rides into danger, thinking not foremost of himself, at a time when others are too weak or too selfish to act, or too cowardly to tackle the dragon roaring at their gates. He was so famous that he was chosen to be the patron saint of England. And in fact, that's the reason that churches such as ours, that were started some years ago by English people, named these churches that are scattered around the world oftentimes St. George's, because it was their patron saint. It was the English way of making their stamp upon a place where they've started a church. But here's the thing, is that it wasn't just England that were so captivated by St. George that they made him their patron saint. Portugal. St. George is the patron saint of Portugal. The country of Georgia, also. The country of Germany, also. If you look at the Russian coat of arms, it's got a picture of St. George. And I can't think of any other saint or any other figure in Christian history that was invoked so many times. So sometimes we don't give him enough credit for how significant he is. And he wasn't just a figure in literature. St. George also occasionally figured prominently in history. He did figure prominently in a famous battle in history, the Battle of Agincourt. Now, if you're a historian, you can be forgiven for forgetting exactly what or where, when the Battle of Agincourt was. But if you are an aficionado of William Shakespeare, you know exactly what it was. You know it well. The Battle of Agincourt. Shakespeare wrote about the Battle of Agincourt in his play, Henry V. He memorialized this battle with one of the most beautiful and powerful monologues that he ever wrote. So in the play Henry V, Henry's army was facing harrowing odds. They're fighting France. They're actually in France, fighting France themselves, outnumbered 5-1. But Henry inspired his men to a triumph with his beautiful words, with this amazing oration, with this speech. And the speech, if you remember from Henry V, famously invoked St. Crispin. St. Crispin's Day, one of the most beautiful and famous monologues that Shakespeare wrote. And it's commonly regarded as just an excellent example of eloquence and power in literature. St. Crispin's Day. And like most of Shakespeare's historical dramas, he took a lot of liberties with the truth. Henry V did battle the French at Agincourt, and they were outnumbered 5-1, and they did prevail against all odds. Shakespeare got those things right, but the speech about St. Crispin and St. Crispin's Day, well, it almost certainly never happened. It was all artistic license. Historical records do, however, chronicle that Henry V did invoke a saint on that day when they fought the French at the Battle of Agincourt, but not St. Crispin, St. George. So I'm going to read to you what Shakespeare's moving oration might have sounded like if it were more historically accurate. If we are marked to die, we are enough to do our country loss, and if to live, the fewer men a greater share of honor. I pray thee, wish not one man more, that he which have no stomach to this fight, let him depart. This day is called the Feast of St. George. He but outlives this day and comes home safe will stand at tiptoe when this day is named and rouse him at the name of St. George. He that shall see this day and live old age will yearly on the vigils feast his neighbors and say, for morrow is St. George's. Then he will strip his sleeve and show his scars and say, these wounds I had on St. George's Day. Old men forget it all, shall be forgot, but he'll remember what advantages, what feats he did that day. This story shall a good man teach his son, and George's day shall ne'er go by from this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered, we few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother, and gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed that they were not here and hold their manhoods cheap, whiles any speaks that fought with us upon St. George's Day. Most people probably see our church or walk into our church and they don't think twice about the man that it was named after. In fact, other than those mentioned in the Bible, the apostles, for instance, other people mentioned in the Bible, we don't think too much about the names that we give our churches. But other than those people named in the Bible, other than perhaps the apostle, there's almost no Christian hero more famous than St. George. But all the things that are said about St. George, all the things that are recounted about St. George, all the stories told about St. George, the fairy tales, the minstrel songs, none of them are true. None of it's true. Of course, we know that it's not true because there's no such thing as dragons, but bigger than that, none of the history works out. None of them are true. But what about the real St. George? Was there one? Stories of dragons and princesses abound, but none of them are true. The medieval legends of a knight of heroic feats, they're loved by people everywhere, but none of them are true. So what about the real St. George? What do we know about him? Well, there was a St. George, and this is what we know. This is true. A man named George, or some version of it, was born about the year 280. And he was from a region in Turkey. His father was Cappadocian, and his mother was Palestinian. They were a mixed couple, multi-ethnic. And they came together and they gave birth to George. And they were living in the Roman Empire, and George decided to join the Roman army, and he became a soldier. And he went to the Middle East to serve as a soldier in the Roman army. And while he was there, the Emperor Diocletian began to persecute Christians, and St. George was one. George, this soldier in the Roman army, was a Christian, and he boldly stood up against Diocletian, speaking out that his actions were unjust. So he was arrested. He was thrown into jail. He was tortured. He was told to give up his faith, and he didn't. So on 23rd of April in the year 303, he was beheaded. George was a martyr. He was a martyr in the Middle East under the Emperor Diocletian, and he died because of his commitment to his faith. Now, there were a lot of saints and martyrs who had similar stories, but why did George become so famous? I mean, I don't know, but even though none of the legends about George are true, and even though we don't know why his name traveled and endured almost more than any other person from this era, I think that St. George is an appropriate namesake for this church. Think about it. Like George, we are multicultural, multi-ethnic, come from different places. Like George, we have made our home in the Arab world. Like George, we're the legacy of the ancient church of Carthage that, like George, was formed in the fires of persecution under Diocletian. And like George, some of us in this community are called upon to persevere in our faith amidst a very hostile environment. I think St. George is a perfectly appropriate person to be our namesake. So today, and every 23rd of April, when we celebrate the feast day of St. George, there's no need to recount the stories of slain dragons or rescued princesses. Instead, let's celebrate on this day glorious Christian diversity, a love for the people of this land, and standing firm in our faith, even in times of great difficulty. Amen.